to support real and sustained economic growth is vital. Unfortunately, there remains a difference in the qualification attainment from pupils living in the top 20% most deprived areas and those living in more affluent areas. This inequality is something which has to be tackled, and this can only be done by halting the changes to welfare benefits system and ensuring continuation of free tuition for our students. I have a son at university, for example, and if he wasn't able to get his fees paid, there's no way he would have been able to go. That's a real threat if we remain in the Union. The only way we can establish a fair and equal system and get the party and thus the policies which will work for Scotland is by voting yes in September. We know it's a very important decision and one which should not be taken lightly. We won't get it right all the time. Mistakes will be made along the way. This is, however, a one chance for us to put faith in ourselves, to believe that we are a strong nation and that we have the assets to survive as an independent country. When making your decision on the 18th of September, you have to consider if you want to continue to live as part of a union which has created one of the most unequal societies in the developed world. Do you want to continue to have unfair and unjust policies imposed on you, policies not in our best interests? Do you want to have a real say in your future and be able to influence policies wisely for the future of your children and grandchildren and for generations to come? Are you prepared to take the gamble that tuition fees may be introduced for students studying in Scotland if the vote is to stay in the Union? Are you happy to see the continuation of the bedroom tax, leading, there is no doubt, to a rise in poverty levels? See a further eroding of the family unit with the welfare benefit changes and cuts in child benefit, and no guarantee that the current powers held by the Scottish Government will remain as they are. But there are no guarantees whatever you vote for, and indeed in all elections when you vote, you're never 100% sure that the party you vote for will deliver on their promises. So whatever you vote on the 18th, make sure that you do it based on an informed decision and vote wisely for the future of Scotland and for the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Next we've got Lewis McLean, who bakes the best rolls in Forest, possibly in Moray.
Yeah, not in Scotland anyway. I lost that title on Saturday to a baker from there, but never mind. My name's Lewis McLean, Managing Director of McLean's Highland Bakery in Forest. We employ 125 people, and we sell locally and nationally, and even export some products as well. And very much a family business. And if anybody who knew me would think, why was I standing up here speaking about independence? If they told me that a year ago, I'd have told them they were off their heads. And but yet, I find myself up here, and I'll just explain my wee journey to finding myself up here. And so about a year ago, I probably went to a yes meeting at the town hall with my mother's husband. And for the first half of the meeting, I was listening to the gentleman, and I couldn't grasp the concept of the Yes campaign, because both Richard Lockhead and Angus Robertson were sitting behind me and they never said a word. So by the time the concept sort of sunk in, the meeting was over. So then probably a month later I went to, well, I also consider myself a responsible employer, so I wanted to find out what the ramifications were about independence for my staff and my family. So I went to a Business for Scotland meeting just like this in Glasgow, and after the meeting I really came away with just a slightly different mindset, more of what we could do rather than, I'm going to say, a year of what we couldn't do if we had independence. And it was only really after I went to a second meeting I came away, and I would say my head was ruling my heart rather than the other way about. And I just feel independence offers so many opportunities to us as a country, opens so many doors. But at the same time, I would never try and impose. I'm very quiet for a big guy. I'm very quiet, not like Ian there. I kind of keep in the back foot, and I would never try and impose my opinion on anybody. And my advice to you would be to come to meetings like tonight and find out, what's best for you. We're all business owners, and you all know your business better than anybody else, and it's you that's got to decide that. But I find, but this is probably my 6th or 7th meeting, and each one I pick up a different nugget of information that really just seals it for me every time. And if I was to pick on 3 things, and these change all the time, just depending the weather or what I've heard last. But the first one for me, the lines of communication would be much shorter and direct if all the decisions were made in Edinburgh. And I feel the people in Edinburgh, if they're making the decisions, they would know how that would affect people in the Highlands, the borders and the Central Belt. We're a very diverse country. I'm originally from the island of Lewis, so I know that it's almost a different country altogether. And we've all met somebody from England who's been to Glasgow or Edinburgh and they think they know Scotland. We're much more than that. Secondly, you seem quite a quiet lot in Elgin, but in Forres we're a bit of rebels. So if we were not happy with a decision, we could hire a bus, drive to Edinburgh, we could, I was going to say picket, but maybe lobby's the right word, lobby the MSPs there about any decision, and we would have national coverage in the newspapers, radio, internet and possibly even the television. And if you can try and, what would be our opportunity of doing that just now at Westminster? And lastly, with my business head on, I'm fed up with people saying Scotland's small, we need to be part of a big country. I would say my business is relatively small against my competitors, but one of the things, being small gives me so much of a competitive advantage. I can move quickly to do things, and I think Michelle will keep me right, but I'm going to say the majority countries in the top 20 richest countries are all populations of 5 million and smaller. So for me, it's a yes on the 18th of September. And then I'm going to quietly go into the background, but I'm quite happy to stand up between now and then. Okay, thank you.
Next is with me too. This has got a sell-by date on it, and it's 18th of September, and after that I'm back to my business as well. Next up we've got Michelle Thomson, who's Managing Director of Business for Scotland. You may have seen her on CNBC, YouTube, various other BBC, ITV.
No, I don't think so.
All right, various others. Star of stage and screen, Michelle Thomson.
Thank you. I know I was going to make a joke about the music stand. First of all, can you all hear me okay? Yes. Good. I don't think we need the microphone because that does make it awful horrible. Now, I've got a clicky thing here. There we go.
What's it, Daisy?
Right, bit of feedback there. Okay.
An experienced roadie.
I've entitled this Hearts and Minds, and I should say thank you first of all to Sandy for inviting me up here. I'm having an absolutely marvellous time going to wonderful locations in Scotland and meeting a lot of interesting people. Beautiful. I went out for a wee walk this afternoon. Elgin's absolutely lovely, and I was saying the last time I was up here was when my husband was singing in an opera, and that was a few years ago. So really lovely. Thank you for inviting me here. Hearts and minds. The tendency is, if you read the populist press, you imagine that you're getting two types of yes people, and the perception is that it's someone about, yeah, Scotland, we are better, I just have this emotional tug. And yes, indeed, there are some people like that. But there's also people who've looked at the economic case, and that's particularly what Business for Scotland's trying to focus on. There are some very real, compelling reasons for why we believe that Scotland will be a wealthier country as a result of being independent. And that fits in with the kind of three tenets of which you touched on too, Jackie, around democracy and fairness, and the third is prosperity. So I'm going to chat through some of the economic stuff, and I think given that we're quite a small audience, let's just keep it pretty interactive, let's just have a bit of fun and enjoy ourselves. Now I need to stand here because for some reason my laptop shows all the slides upside down, so I sometimes might need to turn around and look at the slide as well. My journey to yes, I describe myself sometimes as a bit of a serial maverick. I've done a lot in my career. We were chatting earlier about music. I went to what was the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, now the Royal Conservatoire, and was a jobbing piano player for about 5 years. Then started writing music, did a master's in IT because I was writing a lot of music, ended up in financial services for 23 years. Got bored with that, set up my own property company, although it's kind of widget-sized compared to Springfield Properties. But I suppose the reason I'm telling you that is that maybe, one, I've always been prepared to go against the grain. Nobody wanted me to go and do music. You know, that was a kind of, darling, I feel a symphony coming on. Real people didn't make their living through music, and I kind of blithely ignored that. And then doing computer programming. My brother was an actuary, and I did that because I bet him a fiver I could get a job as a computer programmer. Very poor reason, but I suppose what I'm describing is thinking a bit differently about things. And for me, part of that is a debate. You'll meet a lot of people who say, oh, no, you don't think that, do you? Because they're reading it in the newspapers and their friends are saying that. And I think if we've got a job to do, it's saying, yeah, let's just probe, let's just look under the covers a wee bit, let's just question why that might be. So let's move on to that. So entrepreneurs' view of independence, what are we finding within Business for Scotland? Well, indeed, it was Lewis that said that. It's absolutely a statement of fact that the wealthiest countries in the OECD tend to be similar size to Scotland. In fact, 8 out of the top 10, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland and so on, all a similar size, just with Australia and America, the larger countries, and there's a very good reason. As Sandy said, shorter lines of communication, I'm sure we can all allude to that. It takes ages to get anything done when you've got a kind of massive state and it needs to go through all these lines. Remember, government is there to represent us. It's a governance framework. So if we can affect change quickly and effectively, that adds so much more value. Self-determination, responsibility for your actions. We all know the feeling of say, right, no, I'm going to do this and I'm going to take responsibility for it and stand up and be counted. And let's not forget, it's the norm for countries to be responsible for themselves. This isn't unique or different, and in some respects it's almost quite interesting that we're even having this debate. Normal countries have self-determination and run their own affairs. The analogy that's often used is like a management buyout, and what you have in that is a local area. It could be a local division that's used to having diktats from head office, and they're thinking, no, sorry, that just doesn't work here. We know our products and services, we know how they need to be changed to make them give a better sales kind of funnel here. We know how our people like to be dealt with. We can buy this out, we can do this more successfully, and we've seen that a lot of times in business. This is no different. We're talking about we know what needs to happen in Scotland to make things more effective. And then, of course, independence versus dependence. I suppose it's the opposite thing. Okay, so key message number 1. Let no one say to you, Scotland is poor. Scotland is a wealthy country. Now, for years, the tendency's been to use terms like too wee, too poor, too stupid, and I certainly grew up being told that, unbelievably. But at the same time, we now know, thanks to the collection of statistics by the civil service and the government, and incidentally that's both Westminster and the Scottish Government as well, that they come from, that that's not the case at all. So let's just look at the facts here. Over 5-year average, Scots, that's just a 5-year average there, have collected more tax per person than the rest of the UK. Now that's just a fact, that's not my numbers, that goes back to the civil service. But of course, last year wasn't a one-off. That's been the case for the past 30 years, and that's specific, demonstrable, and can be evidenced by the civil service. In actual fact, the thinking is it goes back even further than that. In others, goes back even further than the discovery of oil. But because we can't verify those figures, we're not quoting them. And that's just a wee kind of graph that shows you, so the dark lines are Scotland's kind of tax revenues, and the pink ones are the rest of the UK. And again, these aren't my figures, or indeed Business for Scotland, we've taken them from the civil service. Okay, so GDP, we were laughing about that earlier, don't mention GDP. GDP is a measure, is something that enables you to compare apples with other countries as well. It's a commonly used measure. It's not perfect, it doesn't tell you how wealthy your society is, it doesn't tell you about child poverty. Just as a measure in terms of income, it works and it gives us a sense of it. Okay, so at this point, some of you might be saying, but, and you'd be right to say, but. You're running a deficit, aren't you? And that is correct. Most Western economies, with the exception of Norway, are indeed running a deficit. But then we look at the deficit figures and, what do we find as well? That even Scotland's deficit is less than that of the rest of the UK as well. So yes, we do indeed have a deficit. The difference between what we're raising and what we're spending, it'd be great not to have one at all, but relatively speaking, we are in a healthier position than the rest of the UK. And again, that's the figures over the last 5 years. And again, these incidentally are facts rather than opinions, so that's quite interesting. Okay. This is from the latest kind of GERS figures, and I've mentioned this term GERS. It stands for Government Expenditure Revenue Scotland. That is the name given to those figures. And it shows, just based on last year, that Scotland would be the 14th wealthiest country in the OECD, as compared to the UK at 18th. So consistently, every single year, we have always been in a higher position. And I was pointing out to somebody earlier today, that is based on the current kind of setup of the way our figures run. That excludes things like VAT that is accrued to Westminster, alcohol duties from the likes of Diageo that ship out from London. That excludes them, so the likelihood is that we would be even higher. Okay, and don't believe me, believe this table. That's the kind of top 9 there, and the ones in the dark are the bigger countries. But look at all the similar-sized countries. That's quite useful. So that's another thing I'd encourage you to do. Quash this idea about too wee. One of the interesting facts which we were touching on earlier is that the smaller countries have proved themselves more adept at dealing with the current recession. And one of the facts I was quoting when we were chatting about it at lunchtime today is just recently Ireland is now able to borrow money on the international money markets cheaper than that of the UK. In other words, that's a very firm measure that they're believed to be a better bet than the UK. Now remember where Ireland was just a few years ago. I mean, absolutely desperate, but I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, so again, you don't need to believe me, but would you believe Standard & Poor's, one of the kind of main ratings agencies, A.T. Lawton sort of financial services? And I draw your attention to the second sentence there, even excluding North Sea output. They would expect Scotland to have their highest rating. And of course they're alluding to that all-important AAA rating that the UK unfortunately lost just recently. So that's not our view, Standard & Poor's view. Very interesting. Without oil. Well, let's think about oil. How important oil is exactly, and relatively speaking. You may hear some people saying to you, but what will you do when the oil runs out? Key point here, Scotland's economy is not just based on oil. Onshore, it's got very strong economy, and you mentioned something, Jackie, in terms of tourism, food and drink, obviously very important here, financial services, education, and so on. So oil, about 15% of Scotland's economy, and a large and growing part of Scotland's oil industry is oil industry services. We know that we've still got a great 16 to 24 billion barrels worth of oil with a worth certainly over $1 trillion, and figures vary there, but there's nobody sneezing at it and saying it's not worth diddly squat. I found an interesting fact the other day that the oil that we've had so far has been worth more than the combined value of that taken from Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which probably puts things into perspective. And I also found out some other interesting facts that I didn't have time to throw up into a slide, but what a lady I spoke to earlier today said, well, I'm a bit concerned actually. I hear that somebody said, all the oil companies will leave upon Scotland becoming independent. Now, when people say things like that to me, I say, okay, let's try and look at the facts. That's an assertion. Let's look at the facts. So this is what I found out today, which I thought was quite interesting. So NQuest, a company, are planning a £4.5 billion investment in Aberdeen. Statoil, of course that's a Norwegian company, £5 billion investment. Bank of Scotland estimate 38,000 new oil and gas jobs, this is in the UK, in the next 5 years. There's been an 800% increase in workshop planning applications in the last 12 months in Aberdeen. After in Aberdeen Airport, the Acre building, I think you pronounce it, the largest office building to date in Aberdeen. Now, that doesn't sound to me like an investment that isn't going to yield a return. So I'm kind of disinclined to believe people who might allow you to believe that. Okay, let's look at the UK economy. We know that a large percentage, relatively speaking, 11.6% of UK tax rate is based on financial services. Now, There's an important precedent here. Do you remember when we had all the kind of bank bailouts and there was talk about bankers? We have to stop paying these ridiculous bonuses. That was a kind of cry from the people, if you like. And what the City of London were saying was, well, no, we don't really want to do that, because if we do that, these guys are going to shut up shop and they're going to ship out somewhere else. So, question for you. The oil is in Scotland, it's off our shore, you can't get it out any other way. So, is this perhaps the difference between a gold mine or a casino? Because if the banker guys can just shut up shop and move to Singapore, what would you rather have a large part of your economy predicated upon? I know what my choice would be. Okay, so, this is a rich country, absolutely, let no one tell you otherwise. And I've given you a figure there, 8.5 billion in terms of the money, the additional monies we've raised. That's what it could have been worth in the last 5 years alone. And that's just based on our current figures. Okay, so let's move on to the bit where we have a bit of fun and just quash some of the things you might hear talking about. So we still hear Alistair Darling, who incidentally oversaw one of the most massive kind of crises in financial services, saying, well, you wouldn't have been able to bail out your banks. Now, we make the point, why did banks, the likes of RBS, suddenly become Scottish when there was a failure? Given some of the figures there, 85% of their operations in England. And if you just look at that, 100% governed by what was the FSA in Westminster and 80% losses generated in London. So why did they suddenly become Scottish? Simply because the nameplate that says head office is based in Gogarburn in Edinburgh. And the US Federal Reserve bailed out RBS for that massive sum, 285 billion. I wonder why that is. But of course, the US Fed had very deep pockets around about this time. HBOS for 115 billion, Barclays for 552 billion. That's an incredible figure. Because at the time, and I do remember this, we were being told that Barclays was fine, there was no issues with it, and yet the US Fed were doing that. Key point here, that when an issue, a crisis of this scope and scale happened, governments did a sensible thing, got together and made provision, whether it was cash, whether it was kind of loan offerings. I mean, there was a variety of different types of packages based on where the contagion was, and contagion is the term for basically where it was going to hurt. So RBS was going to hurt the City of London big time, and had Scotland been independent, it would have been the rest of the UK government who would have bailed out most of RBS because it was going to hurt them big time. And likewise, that's why the Fed bailed out Barclays and so on. So that's an important point to realise. Okay. Right, so carrying on with the kind of too poor thing, where does Scotland's wealth come from? And how then does that extrapolate into what we actually have in our pockets at the end of the day? There's a bit of a skewed map here, and hopefully you can see it. I've got the kind of pointy things. Here we go, up here. Now this is where most, and that's obviously sort of coming from the oil, but not too bad through the sort of central belt here. And as you might imagine, a lot of wealth around kind of London, the whole M4 corridor. So that's where, again, using this GDP per capita or per household. And that's where the wealthiest households are located, which is quite interesting. So we don't have a north-south divide that's here, it's actually down here. And so, in terms of wealthiest households, well, we're not doing very well, are we, compared to down here. So let's just flip back for a minute. That's where the wealth is created in Scotland. How did that happen then? And again, that's just a fact. These aren't my figures, they aren't Business for Scotland figures. Okay, to summarise, don't think so. Let no one tell you otherwise. Okay, so why are these people saying that? Why are we being love-bombed, as they're calling it, by, I think Nick Clegg was up today, and David Cameron, obviously, to say, oh, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Well, how about this then? How about a bit of vested interest? Because yes, it's true, I can declare here, some people will lose their job with the advent of independence. And that would be the 59 Westminster MPs who would rather sit in the gravy train and take the money than actually do the right thing by Scotland. So that's probably why, when you look at the kind of money, and if they play their cards right, and I'm sure Alistair Darling's planning this, a seat in the Lords on £300 a day to wear a fur coat, as we always say, and sleep in the benches. Interesting fact, it costs Scotland 10 million a year for the House of Lords. That's the kind of money we need to pay. It costs us 50 million a year for the Houses of Westminster. That's an immediate saving. Don't just ask about the cost of independence, ask about the savings. Okay, funny quote there that one of our colleagues, Ivan McKee, came up. It's hard to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. Okay, so depending what age you are, we've been here before, because I remember I was on maternity leave with my son when devolution was being discussed, and I remember the then Chief Exec of Standard Life, Scott Bell, making some statement about along the lines of the world would stop revolving in its access if Scotland had devolution. And I remember phoning incensed into Radio Scotland and saying, how dare he doesn't speak for the employees. I was on maternity leave, and the person interviewing me saying, and who is it you work for? And going, because I was working for Standard Life at that time. I thought I'd better keep quiet about that. But we've been here before, and this is a sort of funny thing about that, how much of these things actually are left. You know, so it's not worked out hellish well, has it? Okay, I think we all know what that means. It's a fact, and Jackie mentioned this, that Scotland is the most favoured location for inward investment after London and the South East. And again, not our figures, Ernst & Young, their inward investment report. So, uncertainty, this kind of thing about uncertainty. I mean, I don't know anyone in business who deals with absolutes. I mean, you spend your life, whether it's big business, I worked in many of them, or my own business, where you're scanning horizons going, right, what's going to come and hit you? Because actually you're just doing your job. Uncertainty, the only constant is change. There's uncertainty all around us. I'm not convinced by that at all. There's some graphs here about inward investment. Obviously, in terms of sort of velvet divorce, but I thought that was quite interesting to show you in terms of how inward investment went up in these various countries after independence. And I mean, my sector now is property. I feel very optimistic about that, because actually there's some very good fundamentals in property, specifically our mature legal system, our established social infrastructure that makes, to me, property a good bet. I'm sure you have your own ideas as well, Sandy. Okay, pensions. Again, this is another one the other day. I quite enjoyed that. You won't get paid your pensions. Now, despite the fact that that was refuted so clearly at a Westminster Select Committee meeting only recently, let's remind ourselves just how lauded these pensions are. Well, only the Mexicans have a worse state pension. Okay. We sometimes hear this thing about, you pay so much money, all that public sector, it's draining. But again, an interesting fact, in terms of social protection, Scotland is paying less than that of the rest of the UK. These aren't my numbers, they're drawn from these self-same GERS figures. Isn't that interesting? So, this is a good graph or a bad graph, depending on your point of view. Mostly I'm inclined towards bad. The reason being is it shows male life expectancy throughout the UK. Now, the worst area is in here, sort of Glasgow and Greater Glasgow. Scotland's not looking too healthy. This is not too bad at all. There's a tiny wee bit in there just in sort of Kensington, Chelsea, which is the darkest green, but it's so small you can't actually see it. Now, on the upside, our men, because this is typified by men, are dying younger on average across Scotland. So we're paying out pensions at a government level for less time. Very bad, though, that our men, due to our health and inequality issues, which we haven't even begun to talk about, that's a whole different area, but you obviously alluded to it, Jackie, isn't that absolutely dreadful? And again, these aren't our figures. Okay. This is a wee bit of fun that one of my colleagues came up with. He said it was like the kind of genie in the lamp about just how blessed we are in Scotland. So the guy comes down from the hill and he finds a lamp and rubs it, and of course the genie appears and says, "Now, master, you have as many wishes as you like. What would you wish for in Norway?" So he says, "Well, I mean, obviously we're just doing grand in Norway, but what I'd really like, because I'm in business, is could you make Norwegian the kind of international business language? You can go anywhere in the world and conduct your business." And that kind of, I'm like, okay, we'll sort that then. Well, the other thing is when we have a night off and we want to go and drink our national drink, it's just not very well known. Could you make our national drink something that's recognised as an international brand right throughout the world? Okay, well, we'll do that. And see, while we're on it, can you just sort our weather, because it's hellish hot in the summer and it's just a disaster, it's so cold in the winter, we need to shut down our operations. Could you make it a wee bit more boring, never brilliant, never dead cold, just within, all right, okay, we'll do that. Any more? Yeah, see, while you're on it, could you do something else as well? Could you make it quite easy to travel from the main kind of landmass so that we can get our business done? Could you provide a good infrastructure that doesn't take days to get anywhere? Aye, we could do that as well. I think you get the drift. We're incredibly blessed. Okay, that's talking about the minds bit, but if I could just talk a wee bit about hearts. This is not an end in itself. Independence, and even the kind of wealthy thing. Yeah, we all want to be wealthier, but there's much more to it. It's not independence for independence sake. It's fundamentally about providing the control, obviously fiscal levers, but other kind of spirit and ambition to really change things in our society. There's so many things that are wrong. I was saying earlier that I didn't realise this. I knew 1 in 5 children in Scotland lived in poverty. I didn't know that 1 in 9 lived in abject poverty, as described by Oxfam. So for a country, if we go back and revisit those figures, how did that happen? I personally would like to see considerable changes there. Put education up there. And it's not even just about free education, it's the absolute drive, ambition to be entrepreneurial and lead the world once again. Wouldn't that be fantastic? I have massive ambition for Scotland and the things we're capable of doing if we can really have this all-important burst of energy. There's a statistic that we found out in Business for Scotland about what happens on the day of the vote. Now, some of you may have heard this before, but it's a London marketing agency that calculated to buy the airtime on TV in the 24 hours before the vote, it would cost you, guessing, about 800 million to £1 billion to buy that airtime. So let's think for a minute about Scotland, the brand, and what it means if you're an affiliate Scot, an affinity Scot based around the world. What are they going to say? What are they going to say? Are we going to say we are the newest, most exciting, re-emerging economy on the world stage that's going to do things even better than Norway? Or are we going to say we're no more a nation than Shropshire? And think about what that means in brand considerations and what message that sends out. Scotland are brave? We'd like to think so. Let's just think for a minute about what does an international country, a region, because we are ostensibly currently a region of the UK in governance and control terms. Well, embassies, I mean, talking about property, I've started eyeing up those lovely kind of period properties, because that's exactly what happened in some of these countries in the Velvet Divorce, the quality ones, because they're just going to go one way because there would need to be a need for embassies. Sandy quoted a kind of fact we found out earlier today. Within Business for Scotland, we did a bit of an experiment on St Andrew's Day last year and asked one of the interns to phone a lot of the kind of key embassies around the world and ask specifically what the British embassies were doing to promote Scotland in St Andrew's Day, because of course there's an absolute link in terms of marketing products. And to a man, universally, whether it was Paris, whether it was Berlin, whether it was Rome, the answer came back, they were doing nothing. In fact, it hadn't even occurred to them to do anything. So how is that serving us? Head offices. Now this is interesting. If you speak to the kind of big companies, as I do, I've still got a lot of friends who are in the boards of the large corporates. Why are their head offices located in London? Because it's incredibly expensive for their staff. Real estate is really, really over the top. It's to be close to the seat of power. It's to be close to the seat of decision making. So if that was in Edinburgh, guess where they would be? Why is Diageo headquartered in London when their main export is whiskey? Doesn't make sense. A strong brand I've put in there. We've started within Business for Scotland doing some work about what makes a really strong brand and how could Scotland be positioned to take advantage of its amazing brand that it's got worldwide. And some of the things that are required for a strong brand, we already have these in a bucket load. Qatar, for example, is going to be one of the strong brands. What does Qatar have in terms of history, infrastructure, legal services? We're already light years ahead. Okay, so there's some examples here. I mean, we probably want to get on to questions focusing on higher added value. We know we're not going to compete, we're not going to differentiate in labour costs. We're going to have to do it with quality, high branded products. We can make things easier for small businesses to grow. We all know, if we've been involved in business, you go through the pain. As soon as you hit the VAT threshold, oh God, it's a nightmare, just adds on more time. The bureaucracy and the red tape, we have the chance to change